How do you spot early signs of what's going to change? In other words, how do you separate the noise from the signal? There are always kind of tantalizing things out there that are happening that suddenly disappear or suddenly become highly significant. What's the process of making the difference between those things?
There's a whole subgenre within futures work around emerging issues analysis, which broadly speaking tends to draw on S-curve models of social change. So,
and what are those?
Well, an S-curve model of social change it follows an
S-curve,
and it follows an S-curve. Absolutely. One of the ways we describe it to clients sometimes is through using a around the year metaphor. So, in the spring phase of an S, there's sort of not a lot going on. What's happening is a bit sort of below the surface. It's not very interesting. There's not a lot of activity. As it sort of accelerates through an S-curve, as more people become aware of something, we sort of talk about summer. It's sort of, there's a lot of movement, lots of energy. As that moves into kind of more mass sort of phase, you start getting into autumn, and then obviously you're into winter, and everybody knows about this thing, and actually it's sort of reached the end of its sort of cycle, and things are moving on to a new phase. And the way you spot those spring and summer things typically is by, there's an argument in emerging issues, which is what you're looking for is patient zero, the very first identification of an event. Actually, that doesn't really work because you don't know whether patient zero is just somebody who's completely bonking. These are social phenomena we're talking about. So what you're actually looking for is small emerging constituencies. So, it's the sort of, it's not the leader, it's the followers. The followers are the sort of clue that something might be going on. And then what you'll start seeing is, as it moves along through the spring towards the summer, you'll start seeing more people referring to it. You'll start seeing sorts of journalists who are interested in new stuff picking it up, and it moves to the, it gets a mention in, so say in the UK it might be The Guardian or, or Mother Jones in the United States. So you start seeing sort of those things being picked up there. And then you start seeing move into the, say, talking social issues or policy issues, you start seeing some of the think tanks picking them up and writing reports about them. So and if you do that from a scientific point of view, you can look at the credibility of journals and whether they're actually peer reviewed and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So if you go back to Brian Arthur and his terrible struggle to get the economics of increasing returns, that was published in a number of places before he finally got it into the kind of the mainstream economics journals, where it was a kind of a taboo that there could be increasing returns in economics. But you could see already that people who are going to the Santa Fe Institute were talking about it. You could see
it was an idea that was arriving.
It was an idea that was arriving. Business people were starting to talk about it, especially people who were likely to benefit from it. And you could see some of the maths and physicists sort of starting to sort of get interested in the theory of it. And you could see some of the fringe economics journals picking it up as well. So you start sort of seeing the constituency forms and hardens, and sometimes it vanishes again, as you say.
Yeah. And is there anything numeric in this that you can actually pick out?
Typically not.
You don't have a critical mass, which...
There's a theory that's popular at the moment which says that when you get to 10% of the population holding a view, that's a sign that it is going to become mainstream. I think it's quite early days on that theory, but obviously people are working on that. But typically so far in the literature, the assessment of emerging issues and weak signals has been very much a qualitative piece of work.
Yeah.
Rather than quantitative.
Rather than numbers. Yeah. And some trends, like the impact of falling prices of phone and internet use, are fairly easy to read. Others come like a bolt out of the blue. The oil price spike in 1973, for example. How do you deal with discontinuous events that can't be read through the rear-view mirror of history?
I think one of the things you're trying to do when you do scenarios work is help people think about things which might represent discontinuous change. That actually as you go through the process with a client of building a scenario story and building your understanding of it, quite often people will say to you, that could happen, something, I've just noticed in the scenario that this could happen and these would be the circumstances in which it might happen. So in some ways you're trying to do that kind of preparedness. You're helping prepare your clients for sort of the unexpected quite often when you're doing scenarios work. A lot of it's just about building agility.
Yes, and presumably for somebody like a car manufacturer, you would talk about a major recall, or give me some examples of the kinds of...
Well, I think the sorts of things which are more likely to be disruptive to car manufacturers are not, a recall's an expected device, which an expected event, which they're going to suffer from time to time. If you're looking at this from the perspective of a car manufacturer, you'd be looking at things like the shared car schemes. You'd be looking, I think, more deeply at the fact that for quite strong signs that in the millennial generation, 16 to 24-year-olds, actually their signs of status are no longer about having a car. That's something that's convenient to them in certain circumstances. Their signs of status are tied up with their technology, the phone they have, the computer they have, the applications they have. So actually, suddenly there's a whole kind of group for whom the car is no longer that important, and paying premiums for a car is no longer important at all. So I'd be more worried about a kind of a value shift coming through on that generation, and seeing possibly quite a rapid change in attitudes towards the car, towards ownership of the car, and towards the value of the perceived value of the car, than I would be about something which is really in the operating environment, which is we need to have a decent recall system. That said, we were talking to a client who was very badly disrupted by the Japanese earthquake last year, because they actually hadn't thought through the kind of the implications of that sort of big external shock. And one of their competitors, which had done some of that work and actually had better recovery systems and more resilient supply chains in operation, actually had a big advantage over this client in that market for about 6 months. So some of it is about testing for, we call them wildcards. They're not really wildcards. A wildcard is a high impact, low probability event. Actually, if you're a global company, you are going to suffer from tsunamis in some markets. You are going to suffer from
extreme weather.
Some markets you are going to suffer from extreme weather. So again, things which I think earlier in the kind of the evolution of futures we used to think of as being wildcards, actually they're part of your normal strategic planning now, and all futures might do is help you explore some of the sort of more complex parts of the issue.
Yeah, and what to do about it.
Yeah.
And do you find that you have to challenge your clients about their view of the future, that for some of them things might not work out as they hoped or expected?
I think that's quite often the case. I'm going to have to be a bit vague here, but one of my colleagues was doing a study tour with a company in the United States that was interested in the future of mobility, and they'd been to see an architect in the States, and the architect had said, well, our vision of downtown of this large city is that it'll be 50% less cars driving through the middle of the city in 10 to 15 years' time. And the client didn't share that worldview, and didn't share that view of the future of the car. Was sort of joking about how extreme and utopian that view was as they left the building. And the next stop on that trip was with somebody in the transportation department of the same city. He said, well, we're planning to reduce car use in the centre downtown area by 40% over the next 10 years. So suddenly, sort of being a bit blind to this, regarding this change as being something that was a bit utopian and the sort of thing that architects talked about. Suddenly you're talking to the people who actually have got the power to make that change, and they say that's their same vision. So, that's quite a good example of, reperceiving. That was a bit of a kind of a, shock therapy version of reperceiving. Not very much that's gentle about that. Yeah. But I
was very struck by the mayor of Houston saying that they're going to build, 2 light railways in the capital of oil.
So in the course of an afternoon, that client had gone from an assumption that no American city was going to be kind of scaling back cars anytime soon, to actually talking to a transportation department who had that in their plan. I talked recently, again, I'm going to be a little bit vague here, to a client in one of the deregulated sectors in the UK, and one of the scenarios that came out of that work, quite long-term work, was reversion of this privatised sector to public control. The scenario is a bit vague as to the nature of that public control, but clearly back into some form of public ownership. And again, there were people involved in those discussions who'd been involved in the evolution of the sector from being a state-controlled sector in the UK 20 years ago to where it is now, which is largely it's largely regulated but privately managed. And some of them had real problems saying, well, why is that going to happen? So sometimes, you can be locked into a model of the past and actually not see that there could be new versions of that past thing that you've got a mental model of coming through in the future. There's a famous futurist called James Data in Hawaii, and he talks about this. He says that there's three things in the future. One is things in the present which are going to extend into the future. One is things which were in the past and which become submerged in the present, which will re-emerge. And one is novelties, which are the things we need to think about how they might come to pass in the future. And I think quite often people have problems thinking that things which have been there in the past are going to re-emerge in the future because, the times arrow model, which is, certainly in Western cultures, not so much in Asian cultures, which the notion that time has gone and things have passed.
History is progressive.
History is progressive. Actually, a lot of futures work is about thinking about cycles rather than progress.
And that things will come back. Yeah. The discussion of cars and the use of cars brings me nicely to I want to turn you to a specific example. One day there will be no oil or significantly less oil than we've become accustomed to. The question is in two parts. What's the timeline for this and how will this affect individuals and businesses?
The problem with answering the question about the timeline is that it's a very complex system. Doesn't mean I'm not going to have a go, but actually the decline in oil is locked into a whole lot of issues about our response to that and our adaptation to that. But let's just sort of unfold the story a bit and see how we go. Obviously until 2 or 3 years ago, people who believed that peak oil, the point at which we'd used up half of the reserves, was going to happen any time soon, were kind of regarded as extremely marginal, and they were extremely marginalised as well. Right now, even the International Energy Agency, which probably it's fairly conservative, but it's definitely mainstream, seems to be suggesting that we've passed the point of peak oil probably in 2008, possibly in 2007. The data's a bit unclear. So what we end up with then is there's less oil to extract. It's harder to extract the stuff that we know is there.
And therefore more expensive.
More expensive, it's riskier, as BP discovered. And some of the alternative oil sources, things like tar sands and all the rest of it, are both expensive in terms of extracting them and also environmentally disastrous. So you've already got quite a complex system there, which is what alternatives are there in terms of just oil, and what's the price point going to be. Now, moving beyond that, obviously there's alternatives here. There's quite a lot of renewables out there. We're vastly underinvested in renewables pretty much everywhere. Even in China and Germany, where they've been world leaders, they're probably underinvested as where they'd probably want to be. So part of the question is to what extent can you get substitutes in place? Right now, if you had any significant number of electrically powered vehicles on the UK grid, you'd crash the electricity system. That's the perceived view anyway. Probably true. So then you get into the extent to which people start modifying their behaviour. And you also get the point that actually as you have sort of falling oil availability, but you still have quite strong industrial growth in emerging markets, demand is
increasing
supply.
Yeah. And
so you're in a classic sort of price going up. Actually, then you get into another piece of the complex systems picture, which is that does that price move up steadily or does it spike? And although every hedge fund manager in the world denies they've had anything to do whatsoever to any of the oil price spikes we've had recently, there seems some evidence to say that some of the really uneven behaviour,
the
jaggedness has been caused by speculators coming in, speculators going out again, as it has in the food market as well. So that's all a very complicated way of saying that actually it's hard to predict what's going to happen, except that we know that the price will go up. We don't know how fast it'll go up. We don't know what the trend line is like yet. But then on top of that, you have another part of this equation, which is while there is not sufficient alternatives in terms of energy supply, Other alternatives to energy supply, apart from increasing the use of coal, also environmentally disastrous. And even that only substitutes for certain things that oil can do. While you don't have those, every time demand's picking up and supply is squeezed,